Okay. Happy Wednesday, everyone. Happy October 30th. Thank you so much for joining us for today's career growth session. We are so excited to be talking to Stella today. But before we hop into it, a little bit about our TMRGs, about the context, about why we're here. My name is Pilar Mejía. I am the Senior Ecosystem Manager for Public Sector Distribution, which is a mouthful, but basically it means I get to work with our awesome partners supporting the public sector sales organization. Today I'm wearing my Gente TMRG hat, so I'm also the lead and one of the co-founders of our Gente TMRG here at GitLab. And when we took a look at our fiscal 25 and what we wanted to focus on, one thing that kept on coming up over and over again for us was career growth. Folks were trying to figure out what their next step was here at GitLab. They weren't quite sure what that looked like. They were looking for some answers. So we're getting curious. We're tapping folks on the shoulder across the virtual office, and we're doing a little research to see what kind of tools and resources we have, things like the IGP, Individual Growth Plan, or our promotion doc. And we're talking to our leaders. How did they get to where they are? What does their organization look like? Because we realize career growth isn't always a straight line up. Sometimes it can be lateral. It can be into different parts of the organization. And then, of course, our TMRGs. So for those of you that maybe are newer to GitLab or are not familiar with them, those are our team member resource groups. We are an all remote company, so we have to be really intentional about creating spaces where we can connect with each other, where we can build communities. And that's exactly what we do in these TMRGs. So this month's TMRG collab and shout out is the Caregivers TMRG. So I'm so excited to have a co-host with me today. Gena, thank you so much for making the time. Super excited to have this conversation with you. Do you want to introduce yourself and maybe
Yeah,
tell us a little about the TMRG if you like?
absolutely. Thank you, Pilar, for inviting our TMRG to join this month. We're super excited about it. My name is Gena Schwam. For those that don't know me, I am the Senior Executive Business Administrator to David DeSanto, who is our Chief Product Officer at GitLab. I've been with GitLab for a little over 2 years now. And last year, I was fortunate enough to be invited to help found a new TMRG at GitLab. And this is the Caregivers TMRG. So we are the newest, most recent TMRG at the company. We're probably the least well-known. And so we have a couple of links here that Pilar has generously put into the doc that have links to our handbook page with where you can sign up in the Google group. I've also linked under my introduction, not really linked, but shout out to our Slack channel, caregivers.-TMRG. We would love to have more people join. I'd love to kind of clarify that we are not just a group for parents at GitLab. We are caregivers who are managing elderly parents, disabled family members, people with health conditions. So it's sort of a broad swath and covers probably a large percentage of the GitLab population. So please spread the word about our TMRG. We have lots of wonderful resources. A little bit more about me. I was very interested in joining as a co-lead for this TMRG because I myself am a single parent full-time with 2 young children, and I'm balancing a very demanding career here at GitLab supporting our CPO. And I'm always looking to connect with people and sort of share ideas and resources for how to balance busy lives, whether it's parenting or other types of caregiving. So that's about me. I, again, shout out to hopefully the rest of the company can start joining our TMRG and making use of it. I guess we'll hop right in here, moving right along. I am super excited to dive deep with Stella today as well, because Stella and I have worked closely, sort of the EBA realm interacts very frequently with the chief of staff, with the office of the CEO. And I'm very interested to hear Stella's perspective on how she balances her busy life. So I guess let's go right into it. Stella, please give us your introduction.
Thanks, Gina, and thanks, Pilar. Pilar and I do, I'd say, a quarterly coffee chat, and it is always the highlight of my quarter. So she told me we'd get to do that with more people. And Gina, you and I chat a lot, so it's fun to do this with you. I appreciate you having me. I was asked to just start with the background. So I am from Southern California. I went to school on the East Coast. When I got into school, I discovered this thing called sociology. And the reason why I was attracted to it, it is the psychology of masses. And it's why do people build things in a certain way, what works and what doesn't. And there was nothing called organizational design or business design in my college, but that's what I loved. It was like, how do you build something so it actually works? And what happens when you don't? And how destructive is that? And I think I've taken that into pretty much everything I've done since. And from there, I landed in consulting at McKinsey and learned all the frameworks, had a great 21 months, but fell to scratch to just have an adventure. And that's what led me to, I think, the first real big jump in my career where I did economic development. I went to Swaziland and helped them set up a goat industry. And it was wild because I was 22 and I was making big decisions that impacted people's lives. And there was no playbook. There was really no one to talk to. And it felt important and it was scary. It was really scary to be that little and making decisions that felt important. So I did what a lot of insecure people did. I went to business school and that was amazing for so many reasons. It didn't give me the life clarity I'd hoped for, but it did give me a really great internship at the first startup I was part of. And I loved, similar to being in economic development in Africa, I loved that ability to just like own things and see that problem and go for it and feel that the work I had a lot of impact, which is something you don't get in every job, but I think you get at companies like GitLab, which is one of the reasons why I love it here. From there, I took a short stint as director of Special Olympics International, and I worked with their 100 or so countries, and I had a great time, but I also had this insight, which is I'd spent a lot of my career within nonprofits in different ways. And a lot of times the people they hired for their leader positions were actually in for-profits. So after this insight, I thought, let me go back to this corporate world for a bit, figure it out. Maybe I'll go back later. So that was that pivot. And then I called a friend because I had done a lot of cost-cutting consulting. Growth looked like a lot more fun. Sitting in 2010 or so, when I was looking at it, tech was like the thing to do. So sociology major, not a technical background. And my friend said, hey, join this really fast-growing company I'm part of. We're the fastest thing in Silicon Valley. And by the way, you're going to be a customer success person because you're not technical at all. So I did that and I went on that path. And as part of that company, it grew the fastest ever for 3 months. And then it didn't. Google changed an algorithm and it was part of my first growth and then cut and then growth and cut. And that's a lot of what you find in most companies. But as a part of fast growing and sometimes less fast growing company, I got to see a lot of that. And within customer success, I was able to build a greater work as well, where I started to do operations. I looked at what people are doing. I saw an efficiency and I said, why are we making 6 decks a different way? Let's create a template. Or it looks like there's this thing breaking on the tech side. How do I partner with them? Or why are we using 6 different technologies? Let's rationalize. And eventually the CEO of that company looked at me and is like, why are you in customer success? You should, first of all, be managing people. Then past that, why don't you just go into operations? And I took that to London office. I opened that. It was a lot of fun. I got to wear all the hats because there was no one from marketing on site. There was no one from all the functions. So I had to do those things. And then he came back to me, he's like, hey, do you really want to do operations? And I said, yes. And the next day he let go one of the execs. And I actually got to wear the hat of that role for a while, which was kind of fun. Had a great time, but then I had a baby. And for some folks on this call who've had a baby, it can change your view of the world. It can change your sense of what you want to do. And I came back needing to feel like I was jumping into something real, keep the career part of me going. And the opportunity just wasn't there in the same way. So I got itchy and I joined a startup with about 40 people with the intention of being VP of Ops and scaling it to 100. At the end of the first year, it was clear they just weren't there yet. So I led a mini layoff, including myself. And during that time, got approached by a recruiter who said, hey, there's these 6 jobs you should look at. And I looked at the 7th, which was GitLab, and said, I want to talk about that one. And they're like, no, that's a chief of staff role. That's not for you. And I think you asked next, Pilar, like, what does a chief of staff do? The answer is it could be anything. It depends on the exec. It depends on the company. But for this specific role, I read about GitLab, and this was back in 2019. So this crazy company that was all remote when like no one would do that, and was operating with a handbook, which really still no one does. Increasingly, like I'm finding that's the case. Apologies, I'm working through a cold here, but I'm trying to do my best for you. So this is back in 2019. So as an operator, I was like, whoa, if I'm going to learn about operations, this is like the sandbox to do it in. And then I met Sid. I thought incredibly highly of him. And with the chief of staff, something you really need to do is have a good partnership with your exec. Is this someone you can respect? Is this someone who operates in the way that you're going to learn from them? And then the job itself was really neat. It was a lot of rhythm type activities. So how do you make sure that you have OKRs in the right cadence? How do you make sure the company's doing the things it needs to do? But then also special project things, which were exciting. So that's the path that led me to where I am today. Outside of that, I used to consider myself a travel enthusiast. If you asked me, who are you, what do you care about? I would like list countries and be so proud. I think I'd been to 70 something by the time I was 30. That is not my current focus in life. I am a mom of two. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, so I'm a proud caregiver. Also do a little bit of work with my mother because she's getting older, but a lot of my activities are around that. So I lead the Girl Scout troop. I coach a team of 4-year-olds on Sunday mornings, and that's where I spend a lot of my time.
Thank you so much for that. Can you give us an overview of your role at GitLab? What exactly does a chief of staff do, and how has the role evolved in the past year?
Right. I think I talked a little bit about what I do, but it's contingent on what Sid wants and what the business needs. Sometimes there's a healthy amount of tension there, and I see part of my job is trying to surface those conversations. But the things I always own are things like rhythm activities and OKRs. And within the past year or so specifically, I think a few things that I'd highlight is we did change our brand from chief of staff to office of the CEO. And I think that's meaningful because I've done a lot of research on this recently, and we're at the front of what I see as a trend within this, where a lot of organizations of our size are starting to build these things out. And I think we've been able to offer some thought leadership on like what a path to that looks like. So that's been really exciting. And I'm thankful for the team stumbling with me through this process, because I don't think it was intentional, but I think we built something that a lot of people are learning from, which is exciting. We are bringing engineers back into the team. So we had someone who's an engineer about a year ago. We prioritized what we wanted to do. We're looking at it now, and a lot of the things that Sid cares about, for instance, latency can require someone on the team who's able to get more involved there. So welcome, Dakota. I see you on the call. We're also having another person on board in a month. And then as far as thing we're doing less of, which I think is interesting, is a year ago, we were doing a lot of technical program management. And that was a key part of where I think the group was spending its energy. And with things like new product introduction work, some of the work that Natalie and her team have been doing in product, there's just less of a need there. So my team has been working on other things. And that's one of the fascinating things about at least my office of the CEO versus perhaps others. It's one of the organizations you see where we're not trying to like build a bigger kingdom. We're almost trying to give it up. And we got really excited when muscles built in other parts of the organization where things could be owned very well. So there's been things that have sat with us historically. Internal communications used to sit with my team. The handbook used to sit with my team. Thank you, Trey, for taking that one. I see you on the call as well. Appreciate it. Sometimes we're parking lot until things have the right owner, and that's by design.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And I love the idea of the shift in brand and how that's kind of leading a sort of a new trend going forward, maybe in the industry. I'm going to be watching closely to see how that evolves with other tech companies too. Can you give us an overview of your division at GitLab and the cross-functional understanding that we may be lacking at this point?
Yeah, we're very small. So our division is 8 people, so I can name their names. But we have 2 EBAs, both Jeannie and Carla report into me. Jeannie's fully dedicated to Sid. Carla supports half Sid, half me. Engineers, I just spoke about Dakota, who joined the team. Renee's joining in about a month. We have Yen, who's focused fully on Jihu. So I'm a member of Jihu's board, as is Jim Gladen. Jihu is an independent company in China that has exclusivity to GitLab's license. So there's a lot we do there to kind of support them as board members, and Yen works on that and supports that. And then we have 2 directors of strategy and operations, Ian and Payush. Both of them work on big special projects, the small things too sometimes, but they lean into projects that oftentimes are under-resourced, understaffed, or have gaps, and they're able to focus on those and really accelerate them and unblock them in some cases. And then there's a staff of strategy and ops, Artie. Artie is omnipresent in issues. I suspect that most folks on the call are very familiar with Artie, but she helps on special projects as well, and also has this spidey sense for what's happening across the organization and helps us tap into the right things.
That's great. And what are some key ongoing initiatives that are the top priorities for your team?
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier, it changes over time. At the moment, AI latency is big one. We've been supporting some partnership work. And it's the rhythm activities. So I can't give you a long list of everything, but it tends to be what's important to Sid at the time and a little bit of what's important to me. And we combine that into what the team works on.
Very cool.
I love that. I am so taken by your description of it as the rhythm. That speaks to me, Stella. Little known fact, my bachelor's of arts is actually in music, so super handy in the tech world. Like you too, I had that lovely insecurity that led me to business school as well. So you are speaking right to my heart
What
today.
kind of music?
All of the music. I grew up playing piano, right? So when I got to undergrad, I wasn't quite sure. I was undecided for the longest time. And then I thought, well, I've been doing music. Let's take a look at what it looks like under the hood. So it was a different side of it. So taking a look at the theory, taking a look at the history. So it was really fun, just like any other degree, lots of papers, lots of work. But instead of having to do a thesis at the end, I got to do a recital. So
That is neat.
highly recommend it for those undecided folks who maybe like to sing as well. But yeah, the business part was definitely needed after that. So I'm with you on that. And sociology, I love your description of that. I had never thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. That's probably something that kind of helps you detect what that rhythm of the business is and react to it in more of a like fluid way, right? So
Right.
that's actually a really good building block, I think, for where you are today. And I know you talked about this a little bit, but obviously you've found the office of the CEO. Love the rebrand, by the way. I completely missed the memo on it, so I'm so glad you were here to explain it to us. Um, kind of talk us through again how you stumbled into it and maybe what keeps you there as well.
Yeah. So the stumble was literally an insight that there were a lot of things that Sid wanted me to do and things that I thought I should do that I had no capacity for. So I worked with Sid and I convinced him that I should hire one person. And with this one person, we'd have greater scope and a little bit more of what we needed to accomplish what I really thought we should accomplish. And I hired Christine Lee, who's now on the marketing team. And she was awesome. So awesome that within 6 months, she was gone and no longer on my team. And after that, I said, okay, that worked really well. And everyone's like, yeah, that worked really well. Hire again. So I hired Omar Fernandez and he was really awesome. And 6 months later, he was not on my team. Which is actually good. It's nice to recruit people who can work with other parts of the business. But I think we validated that there was power in having not a lot of people, but 2 or 3 people who could be strategy and operations folks who could jump into special projects that Sid cared about, that maybe weren't the priorities for others people. And that's, I think, at the core of our team. With Jihu, there was a Jihu. It was taking 90% of my time. I couldn't give it 90% of my time. We got Yen. With the EBA search, one day Sid said, hey, Stella, I don't really think I want to do a search. And by the way, I don't think I'm necessarily like the best person to manage an EBA. So do you just want to do that for me? And I said, sure, Sid, whatever. And it wound up being fantastic because something I learned through that process is that a lot of the work that I do and a lot of what I think about is how do I optimize for Sid? And that means being really aligned with the EBA on his schedule, his priorities, how to message for him. So it's been an incredible partnership and it's been great to work closely with Jeannie and Carla beyond what I might usually. So it was a stumbling. And at each point it was like, how do I do the next right thing or what's being asked of me? And at some point we had a team that usually somewhere between 8 and 10 people. But the funny thing is at some point Sid was like, hey, Stella, you built this thing. And I started Googling, I'm like, oh, I did build this thing. It's called the Office of the CEO. And having done some research since, it does seem like it is a thing. About 15% of companies have something like this. They tend to be big government organizations. So Pilar, maybe you're seeing them in your business. They tend to be larger corporates or big tech, but they're not the smaller business, but I see that changing. And it's been interesting because in 2013, there was an article called Feel the Chief of Staff. And it was this really cool article because everyone sort of had something like a chief of staff, but similarly, it wasn't named. And it was something that you found in government and big tech and big corporate. And there was this sense all of a sudden with New York Times calling out like, hey, everyone wants this thing. Everyone wants an accelerator who can map to an exec and just help them achieve a bit more. And right after that, there was like a huge proliferation. And there continued to be until like the early 2020s, because I still get calls and sometimes Sid and I will be on a call together with some founders friends with saying like, hey, I think I'm going to hire my first chief of staff. Like, what will that look like? And you even see within GitLab, we have Eileen, we have David Schwam, we have Craig now are supporting our execs. So there's like a proliferation of chief of staff. And I think when you think about the office of the CEO, it's like the next wave of that, which is a lot of people are kind of stumbling within their chief of staff teams toward like their first hire or second hire because it makes sense. So they don't necessarily know it, but they're also building toward the office of the CTO, the CEO, name your principal. But I see it's kind of a movement that's happening and is looking different in different places.
Yeah, that is such a cool observation, and it's such a good call out too for the other chief of staffs here at GitLab. Sometimes I'd looked at them and be like, wait, I don't quite understand how this ties into everything else. But I had a chance to take a look at the article that someone linked at the top with the resources, and I liked I think it was something like a work twin analogy to the person that they're, supporting, which I thought was so cool and so necessary in an environment like this that's so fast moving. And to your earlier point, we're constantly iterating, right? That's the GitLab way. We've got to pivot. That's one thing I always tell people who are asking about it. Like, what does it take to succeed here? I'm like, you got to be ready to pivot. So it
Yeah.
sounds like that's what you and your team have mastered. So speaking of your team, I love that you included the alumni in the slide deck. That was so fun to see the familiar faces, Christy, Omar. But what kind of backgrounds do your team members typically come from? And are there any like skills that really make for a good chief of staff office or of the CEO professional?
Yeah. Oh, those are two different questions. Like my team versus a chief of staff. For my team specifically, and I think you're referencing the strategy and operations role, it's where the company currently is. And I think that's actually the answer for all of it because the chief of staff I had to be 4.5 years ago for SID is different than the chief of staff today. As a public company, as a company that's matured, as a company that does things a little bit differently. And that's good. And I think similarly within my team, strong consulting background is really important. Low ego is really important. Adherence to values are very important, probably even more from my team than others because we are so closely associated with the CEO and he's a very values-driven CEO, which is great. So those are kind of must-haves. Beyond that, it's like, can you jump quickly into a project? Can you learn things very fast? Can you take something all the way from ideation to its conclusion? But it changes over time. And I mentioned new product introductions earlier. A lot of what we were doing a year and a half ago within the team was helping within that program management. And it's been so cool to see product be able to do so much more there and develop so much muscle there and do less of it. So if I'm hiring today, it might look different from what I was hiring for 2 years ago. And part of that is because how the rest of the organization's matured, how we're changing as a company, what are we focused on? So there's no fixed answer. And I guess that is the answer, which is when you think about hiring, it's dependent on business need. And especially when you're sitting in this role, it changes a lot.
That makes a ton of sense. So the only constant we have around here is change. So I think that's a perfect outlook to have on that. So thank you for that. I did want to go back. You have such an interesting career path. I love the different places you've been. Um, and thank you so much for kind of being so transparent with it all because it's really cool to see that it's not always, again, a little like check the box, next step 1, step 2, step 3. So, but all of it built to a fantastic background for this role. What are some highlights or key milestones when you look back at where you've been and where you are now?
Yeah, I think I mentioned the first highlight, which was being in Africa and I said creating an industry, but what I really did was stop an industry. And I think you had a question later, which is career learnings. And that was a big one for me because one of the most impactful things I did was make sure that nothing happened. And I think as someone who is very big at like, make it happen, make it happen, make it happen, you gauge your success by like what you can showcase. It was counterintuitive to shut something down and feel really good about it. But it's something that had a lot of impact and was meaningful and I took a lot away from. Opening an office in London, it felt like taking off the training wheels. Going out there and wearing the marketing hat and wearing sales partnership hat and a bunch of things I hadn't done before and see it be really successful and see that office become a meaningful contributor and create a bit of a template that we could bring to other countries as we thought about expansion was just like hugely gratifying. And it felt like being a startup within a bigger company in a way that was a lot of fun. And then launching Jihu, and I think for me personally, I have strategy and operations folks who get really involved in a lot of projects, but that was like my baby project when I first got to GitLab was the first thing where I got to work with folks across the business. And there's something very special about getting to do that at GitLab because everyone is incredibly collaborative and everyone is wonderfully smart. And it was neat to be part of this team that birthed something that has gone on to kind of live on its own. And that was very special here. And then I've talked a lot about the Office of CEO. It is top of mind. And I did speak about it last week at a Chief of Staff conference. And I've joked with people that if anyone's actually interested in the concept of an Office of the CEO, it's a meeting dedicated to senior Chief of Staffs. But it was really cool to see the reception of that because, as I've called out before, we've been stumbling into this thing, but I think people are really excited about it. And it makes me proud of the team for building this thing and having that impact so that we can help others learn about it. So those are some of my career milestones.
Those sounds amazing. I kind of want to ask you if you have a recording of your speaking last
I
week.
don't.
Oh my gosh. In our virtual world, I'm so used to recordings. I'm gonna have to get past this terrible loss and catch you at the next one. So thank you so much for sharing all of that, Stella. Gina,
Yeah.
next question.
Yeah, I feel like we could have like a lengthy conversation just about your experience with the goat industry. Like, I kind of want to know a lot more about that. I think I'm gonna have to set up a coffee chat with you to dive in. I think we're going to pivot though right now and kind of focus on sort of the goal of this meeting series, which is to understand your perspective on career growth. And as somebody who, similar to Pilar, had a very liberal arts background, I have my bachelor's in art history. I have a master's in museum studies. I spent 12 years working in the museum industry before I fell into tech. So one thing I've noticed that is sort of a common theme is that no matter what industry you're in, there are career growth tips and tricks that apply to anyone and everyone. So I am super interested to hear about yours. So maybe you could start us off by telling us about the very best career advice you've received.
Ooh, does that mean there should have been one? I put a few.
You can
Don't make me read them.
share more than one. That's fine.
Okay. I think when I was junior, the thing that was most meaningful to me is don't waste your cycles on comparisons. And especially as a consultant or someone in customer success, when there were a lot of people in the role, I would look at other people and I'd be like, oh, they all know what they're doing, and I'm the one spinning. And especially as I became a manager, I realized you never know how the other person is doing. You really don't. I mean, you can have clues, but you really don't. And my manager gave me this advice. I think as I've matured, I see it even more clearly, but there's a lot of harm that comes from looking at others and trying to measure yourself up. It's so much better energy is just to put into yourself and your development and doing your best work and having your most impact. So for me, that was important. And then I already spoke about the measure success by what you stop sometimes in addition to what you complete. I won't talk about that more, but I will call out this one, and it's funny, I think Ashley said something similar in her talk, which was the last one, but the do what you love and it will work out well. So much of what I was learning all the way through business school is like, you're really not great at this thing. You know, you're not great at tech. Like, go online and start coding because that's the thing you need to do to be well-rounded. And I think there's this new emphasis, which is just lean into what you love and you'll make that path work. And as a generalist, that's something I've really had to embrace because you hear people who have spikes and they build their whole careers on spikes. And I've intentionally not done that, for better or worse, but it works for me because I really kind of leaned in to be the person who could look across everything, which has been gratifying. And this one, I was thinking to myself, like, Sid gives me advice all the time. Like, what's the one thing I'd highlight from Sid? But this was toward the beginning. And when I was joining GitLab, I had a friend give me the 90-day book. And I didn't read it, but I do remember talking to Sid and saying, yeah, you know, what am I going to accomplish in these 90 days? And he looked at me and was like, why are you talking about 90 days? Don't you plan to be here for years? And I think about that a lot because I think a lot of us measure our progress in these like little arbitrary windows of time. And it's not to say you shouldn't hit your quarter or you shouldn't hit your annual goals, but I think you also don't want to get stuck in like these little boxes of time. And when I think about success, I think about it short term, I think about it long term, I think about it for the business, I think about it for myself. And I like his more expansive framework for thinking about what growth and impact looks like.
I love those. I think those are so applicable to pretty much everyone on this call, everyone who's going to watch this recording. It's great to keep in mind, like, think about the big picture and the bird's eye view of what you want to achieve. That's great. Is there a mistake? Can you share a mistake that you've learned from? What have you learned the most from your mistakes in your career?
Yeah. When I was in school, I had a lot of success because I was a perfectionist. And I would study really hard, and there would be an answer, and I would know the answer, and I would get a good grade. And that formula serves you really well when you're in college or when you're in school. I found the work world a little bit harder in the sense that there wasn't always a right answer. And I think I learned that most when I was put under someone who'd been very successful in consulting, had done an incredible job, and was ready for their next growth step, which was someone to manage, who was me. And while usually we're in that situation for 3 months, I was with this person for 9. And it was interesting because he found the best management technique was to do the work himself and not involve me because I was his comfort level. And I remember sitting there being like, should I be doing something, or what can I do? Or let me try to do this thing. But it was never really like impactful, and I was never very engaged. And when I got great reviews, but at the end of that, I went to another team. They're like, wow, you really don't know much. And it's true, I really didn't. And I looked back on that as I had asked, like, should I move off the team? How am I doing? What can I do? But it wasn't clicking and it didn't feel right. And in retrospect, it wasn't. And I think that that was the first time where I realized like there wasn't going to be a question where I could work toward the answer always. I kind of needed to define what success looked like. I needed to advocate for myself, or more importantly, like take ownership for my growth, take ownership for impact, and couldn't just necessarily raise to other people's bar at all times. And I think that served me really well because when you think about life, or you think about business, you think about being senior, there's not always going to be like a known answer you can work toward. It's figuring it out, and it's really owning it more clearly. And I learned that there. And then the other is don't make promises. This is one more for early managers, but I think there's a temptation early on to say things like, hey, like how do we make sure you get promotion tomorrow type of stuff. And I found this situation, so much changes in a business that you can't come through on those things. So something I learned early on, but still sticks with me, is like things that I wish I'd done better. It's really important to kind of focus on, this is who you are, this is your growth, this is what we're working on, this is the context of the business. And it doesn't mean not working with people, it doesn't mean supporting people, it doesn't mean being empathetic to people, but it means helping them understand like where they sit in the context of everything else. And I see that as a big part of my job.
Yeah, that's super valuable. Totally love the concept of not making promises that you aren't sure you can keep. I think that's life advice too, right? I mean, it's valuable advice for everybody. Of course, we're also thinking about career growth here at GitLab in terms of promotions. We have our next promotion cycle coming up in the winter here. Can you share with us some core things that you consider when evaluating promotion readiness for your staff?
Yeah, I think the first one I alluded to already, which is what's happening in the company. A lot of times there'll be folks, and this it maybe applies less to my own team, but more broadly, who say, I've checked the boxes, I'm ready. But sometimes you don't need someone at that level. So the one thing I want to emphasize, especially for people who are maybe earlier in their career, is that is a reality. The business need always needs to be part of it. So that's something that I would think about. And then confidence in their ability to do their job. You don't promote always for potential. You're usually looking for the person who's demonstrated they could do the thing. So I think making sure that that has been demonstrated, there's really good proof points, is important. Value alignment and professionalism is really important. And the great thing about our handbook is for different levels, we actually write out what that looks like, but I have an expectation for a certain amount of maturity, and it varies based on level and job. And then for myself, how I think about this is I talk to my manager. This has been said, or at other times other people, but it's looking at, this is where I am, this is where I want to grow, and getting alignment that, yeah, that makes sense, and that they're supportive. For me at GitLab, I'm not looking to move to anywhere but VP, but I still want to make sure that I'm developing the things I'm doing of impact. I'm able to move the needle for SID and be valuable. So it's those conversations around like, this is where I am, this is where I'm growing. And something interesting about GitLab is we are changing and growing so much. I mentioned Sid wouldn't hire me today. If you look at my background, if you look who I am, he probably could have had something different, but it's that growing with him. So in ways, I think it's not a promotion, but just staying at a company like GitLab oftentimes means you're doing a really good job at what you're doing. And I look at it that way. there was one more thing I wanted to talk about there, but I think the agenda moved. So I will, oh, the other one I want to say is imposter syndrome is a real thing. And I want to call it out because I've had it at times. And I think a key thing is be realistic, but also know that a lot of us have imposter syndrome. So try to calibrate on those two things. Because I always find it really interesting that some people ask for promotions. I'm like, huh, you haven't given me the evidence yet. And other people aren't. And I'm wondering, why haven't you? So just throwing it out there into the world, but both types of people exist. So try to figure out where you are on the spectrum as you think about what you're asking for from your manager.
That's really interesting that you bring up imposter syndrome. I think it's probably something that a lot of us grapple with. How have you countered that in your own life? Like, what advice do you have for folks who are struggling with imposter syndrome?
Oh, goodness.
Heavy question, you know?
No, it's a really good question. I would love to have a whole conversation with you about this, Gena, and Pilar as well. But I think the key thing is know what you've done and feel proud of it. And one of the hard things about GitLab is it's not the best place for people with imposter syndrome in the sense that we get something done and we're like, yeah, of course it went well. And or, it didn't go well and we retro it. But especially when it went well, we're like, oh, great, it's done. Like, let's move on to the next thing. So I think the number one thing that helps me with imposter syndrome is like taking that pause and being like, that went well, or this is going well, and spending the time to celebrate those things.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. What are some core things that team members can do to prepare for their own career growth?
Take feedback. Everyone's going to tell you that, but the really important thing is getting feedback. It's really hard to know how you should grow if you're not involving other people in the conversation, because how they see you, how they perceived you, how they see your impact, that's so critical to being successful, because you're not going to be usually successful by yourself, especially when you're part of a big company. And then taking ownership for your growth. You can't expect people to do it for you. It really needs to be led by you. As much as everyone cares about you, as much as people want to support you, you're going to be your own priority more than even the best manager. So you need to take responsibility for that.
Yeah, I think that's such a key point. We have to advocate for ourselves. And I think you said that earlier in the conversation as well, that, it's so important to try to like overcome that imposter syndrome and that fear of negative feedback, and just sort of be willing to, count your wins and your successes and take ownership for your own growth. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that was fantastic. And I'll offer something that we got from our session with the neurodiversibility TMRG, which is like, find a buddy to help you get to that space where you're hyping yourself up, right? Find that person on your team, or maybe someone cross-functional, but that knows you and sees your work, to point the things out. Because sometimes you can't even see all the amazing work you're doing, and you need to hop on a Zoom, grab a coffee chat, and just shower each other with compliments. That was one suggestion. We have some team members that have a standing date to do that, and I think it is brilliant. So the easy one we can all do. But moving on. We know in addition to this very busy career, you are also a caregiver, 6 and 4 years old. You're in the thick of it. They need a lot from you. So I would love to hear from you how you balance being a caregiver. And Stella, you're going to have to keep me honest here, because originally I had written chief of staff, but then in Slack, I see VP chief of staff to the CEO. And then I'm looking at you in Zoom and I see chief of staff COS. So
this is clearly on me. I've always been VP chief of staff, just clearly I'm inconsistent with my titling.
okay, perfect. And being VP chief of staff to the CEO. How do you balance?
Got it. That's right. Thank you. Yeah, it's hard. I really don't like the word balance, because it implies like there's a point where it's actually going to stay and it's going to make sense and it's going to feel great. And I think part of the way I processed being a working mom with 2 little kids is that it's never going to feel as great as I want it to be everywhere. I would love if I could do a pickup a week. My kids ask me to, and it's hard to say, hey, that's just not how we do it as a family. So instead, it's being really clear on trade-offs and being comfortable with those trade-offs. And it's making those decisions very consciously versus letting them happen. And that's how I've made that work. I think about my life across dimensions. Kids are really important. my partner is really important. My broader family is very important, especially because I'm getting into what they call the sandwich years. I'll call it out for people who haven't heard it, but I have little kids, but my parents are aging and they're starting to have real needs. So it's when the collision comes together that things feel even more compressed. Friends are important. Myself is important. I know this. I don't always prioritize it, but things like health and eating well and getting sleep, those are important. And future work, like how's my growth, society, current work, they're all important. So it's about all those dimensions. How am I balancing it? And I'm giving it enough, and it changes. And there's times when you defer, but when I look about right now, I know my kids and my work are my most important things. And it helps me put everything else in the right space. But that doesn't need to be what it looks like in 3 months. And I think I'm comfortable with the ebb and flow of some of those things. As far as resources, it's really important to get as much help as you can. And I know not everyone has the means to, so I'm saying this like knowing everyone has their own context. But when my kids were younger and my husband was working full hours, we had a part-time nanny, we had a meal service, we had gardeners, we had cleaners. I had friends who were organizing the Christmas ornaments. I thought to myself, that's very clever. I never got that far. But there's a lot of things we do because we always did them and they feel like we can do them. And I started using a framework of I can, but am I actually getting value out of this? And that helped me free up a lot of time to focus on what was important, which was kids and work and the other things. So that's how I thought about it. I have processed it. And I think the other thing I've done for myself is every year since my first daughter was about 10 months old, I've given myself like a weekend away. And by given, I mean like, thank you to my partner. He's fantastic in supporting me, letting me do this. But a lot of times when you're running really fast, it feels like life is happening to you and you're like reacting to it. And I found, especially with a lot of priorities, it's important to step away and just feel like, where am I in this moment? Where am I in this month? Like, am I doing what I want to be doing? Am I spending my time in the right way? And it's been helpful for me to ground and almost consciously, well, very consciously make the decisions again. Like, do I want to keep working in this way? Am I giving my kids enough? And it's never going to be everything, but enough. Because otherwise, like you wake up and you find it's happened and you didn't really opt in. So something that's really important to me is like opting into how I'm spending my time versus just being reactive.
That's such a good call out, and it kind of goes back to what you said earlier about making the conscious decisions versus letting those decisions happen to you, right? I hear you kind of hit that point throughout the talk track, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Trying to make the decisions ahead of time is definitely a much better feeling than looking back and saying, "Oops, I missed XYZ." So thank you for sharing all those tips. And I know as we're speaking, I do have someone hanging my Christmas lights. And it's not even Halloween. One of those things I'm so embarrassed to admit, but to your point, I was like, I can't do it. I can't do it all. And this is one thing that, believe it or not, the trade-off is there. Our kids enjoy it so much. And so for us, that is important. So thank you for sharing all of that. I know we only have 6 minutes left, and we've got some great questions here. So in the AMA, we do have an async one. Let's go ahead, Gina, and hit number 6 and see if we can't make it to the end.
Okay. Well, please tell us, Stella, how can we stay informed about your division at GitLab?
Great. I love this question because we used to put out a newsletter, and it's because I got this question, everyone didn't know what we were doing, and everyone all of a sudden felt so satiated that I asked, does anyone actually need this anymore? And everyone's like, no. And I remember thinking that was a moment of joy. Do you know, when I read this question, I'm like, do I need to do the newsletter again? But as a starting point, I'll just point you toward what's in the handbook. We have both a chief of staff team page and also an office of the CEO page. They're great resources. If you want to learn about chief of staffs in general, there are 2 chief of staff networks. I put my personal favorite here though, which is Chief of Staff Network. There's also a good chief of staff podcast. So lots of things about the role itself. If you want to learn about our work, OKRs tend to give you a good sense of the space we're playing in, even if we're not always exact on sharing the individual projects. And then I am recruiting for someone right now, a director of strategy and operations role. So that's a role similar to Ian Payush and David Twan, who recently moved on to the product team. So that's what we're up to and how you can find out more about us.
Very cool. How can everyone contribute to the division team's success?
It's a funny question because I feel like the team exists to contribute to your success and the rest of the company's success. But oftentimes we are showing up in people's projects and we're showing up when they're already underway or maybe there's another priority. So my ask is GitLab is incredibly good at short toes, but help us help you, which means help us have context, help us understand where maybe we are rubbing you because we don't always have the context of the other priorities and everything else you're working on. So just know we really are trying to help. We're there with the best intent, but sometimes we need a little bit of coaching just because we're dropping in cold.
I love that. It ties back into the feedback part of all of this. So we'll be sure to do that for sure.
Yeah. It's all about communication. All right. The next thing we did want to touch on was we'd love to hear your opinion on diverse teams. So what are your thoughts on the benefits that you see from having such a diverse organization?
Yeah, there's benefits of diverse thought and understanding. It is so real, and you see that in team conversations, and I do appreciate that. I think a very clear example I can give is Yena's on my team for Jihu. And there have been so many times where I'm on a call and I come off of it, I'm like, oh, this is what's happening. And she's like, no, like they said this in this way, in this tone, and that is very different. So it's really important we have people who can look at things, interpret things in different ways, and then we have that ability to kind of synthesize that richness of thought. So I've seen diversity be incredibly important and valuable. As far as thinking about diversity within the team, I think the thing I love about our whole talent team is like it is always top and center to them, and it's something that they openly talk about and help with, and it's something we bring into recruiting. And unless there's like a strict timeline, it's something we always create space for. And I think the number one thing that I've been able to do as a manager is take the gas off a lot of recruiting when I can, to make time to make sure we're actually getting the full slate of candidates and we're looking at people who are diverse, which has been great. And then I do a lot of my own searches too. I'll go into LinkedIn and I'll see who I can find.
Yeah, LinkedIn is an amazing resource, y'all. And you never know what networks exist within LinkedIn too that could point you to some great resources. So thank you so much for sharing that. I see we had an async question from Indre, which we've touched on a little bit, but let's go ahead and see if you have any additional thoughts on this, which is how can other teams contribute to the success of the Office of the CEO or engage with the division's initiatives?
Ooh, I'd answer the same way as last time, which is help us help you. But engage in initiatives. We do have an internship program. So at times we've had people look at it, talk to us and say, you're kind of tangentially involved with this thing. No one else is involved with this thing. Can I do an internship and work on it? And Office of the CEO, Stella, you could kind of help me, guide me. So we've done a little bit of that, which I think is a little bit different than us going in and asking to be invited into what you're working on. This is a little bit more self-initiated, and that's the way we've worked with folks.
That's perfect. And if there's a handbook page, I will get it from you and I'll link it to these docs for sure, because that sounds super interesting. With 1 minute on the clock left, I'm going to go ahead and do a super quick wrap up. We talked about promotions earlier. I do want to call out Denise's Slack. So it's linked here in the notes doc that reminds us all, if you're getting ready for promotion, if you're starting to think about it, we have an updated template. We have an updated promotion timeline. Please go ahead and check them out. Make sure you understand when you should be having those conversations with your manager and what you need to come prepared to the table with promotion talk. So take a look at that. If you are interested in joining more sessions like this, please feel free to join our Google group. Next month, we're going to be joining with the Generational Understanding TMAG. Super excited to be talking to them, taking a look at a new division. If you have any comments, ideas, thoughts, we have an anonymous suggestion box. We're here to help you all. So please, just like Stella said, help us help you. GitLab is a really big virtual space. There's lots of resources. There's lots of ways that we can all grow here. So please let us understand how we can help you all grow. And with that being said,
Thank you so much, Stella, for joining us today and having such a lively conversation. Very valuable.
Thank you.
Yes,
For your time.
and thank you all for joining live. We'll see you around the virtual office.
Take care.
Take care.